Cheers, guys. What are you doing while watching? Just relaxing or multitasking? Let me know.
While they were clinking champagne glasses under a chandelier shaped like a golden crown at some five-star hotel in Dubai, laughing too loud and posing for pictures that would later be filtered into the illusion of a perfect family vacation, I was standing in the doorway of my own apartment, our apartment, technically, looking at the life I had built brick by brick, without applause, without praise, and certainly without help. I folded my sweaters with the kind of focus you develop after years of swallowing disappointment, folded them one by one like I used to fold Chase's clothes when Mom asked me to help your brother pack for college, even though he was 20 and perfectly capable of doing it himself. I had packed his bags more times than I had ever packed my own, and now, at 42, I was doing it for the last time, not for him, not for them, but for me. The decision had not been sudden, but the act of leaving felt like a moment stolen from a movie, the kind where the woman finally walks away and doesn't look back. Except there was no dramatic music, no teary goodbye, no witness to my quiet rebellion. Just the soft zip of luggage and the slow realization that no one would be calling, texting, or even noticing. They wouldn't notice until they returned home to find my key on the kitchen counter, the note I'd written in clean, even script. You made your choice. I made mine. And the silence left in my wake. If I had to pinpoint when the story really started, I'd probably say it was around the time I was 16, when Chase crashed Dad's vintage BMW into a lamppost after sneaking out to impress some girl he couldn't even remember the name of 3 days later. I still remember the way Dad stormed into the house, furious, breathing like a bull, until Mom stepped in and said, "Boys make mistakes. Let's not ruin his future over this." That night, I listened from my bedroom as they whispered about paying off the city for the damage and convincing the insurance company it was vandalism. Chase got a new car within a month. I, on the other hand, had to beg to use the family Toyota just to drive to my part-time job at the bookstore. That should have been the first red flag. The first crack in the illusion that fairness lived in our house. But when you're a teenager, you want so badly to believe your family is just a little messy, not broken. I did everything the right way. I stayed out of trouble, graduated summa cum laude, never once asked them for money, and still sent cards on their birthdays, even when they forgot mine. I bought my first condo without help, learned to change my own tires, and sat through endless dinners where Mom would smile across the table and say, "We're just so proud of Chase. His company is doing so well," even though he'd pivoted from app development to crypto to whatever the hell he was pretending to do in Dubai. I stayed silent, always silent, because being the good one meant not rocking the boat, not asking questions, not pointing out how many times I had bailed him out, financially and emotionally, while he gallivanted around the world with their blessing. So when I saw the pictures, the ones Karen had posted with captions like, "Family bonding with our brilliant boy, #blessed Dubai dreams," it wasn't just a straw that broke the camel's back. It was a freight train colliding into the dam of restraint I had spent decades building. It was the betrayal of seeing my mother draped in gold beside a son who couldn't spell accountability if it came with a paycheck. While I was home fixing a leaking pipe, they couldn't be bothered to help with last Thanksgiving. It wasn't the vacation, it wasn't even the champagne. It was the smile on my father's face, genuine, soft, proud, the kind I hadn't seen directed at me since elementary school when I won the spelling bee. And even then, I'd had to remind him to show up. That was the night I logged into my laptop and typed the name I had saved in a notes app under emergency. Ethan Vega, corporate lawyer, sharp as a scalpel, discreet as a shadow, and fully aware of the kinds of games played in families that looked perfect on the outside but had rot in the foundation. I had met him at a charity dinner 3 years ago, one of those dreadful black tie events Mom forced me to attend. Because you're not getting any younger, dear, and you'll never meet anyone if you're always working. Ethan wasn't someone I would have paid much attention to, but he had a quiet confidence I remembered. And more importantly, he had handed me his card with a look that said, "If you ever need to be smarter than your family, call me." I hadn't understood the full meaning of that then, but I understood it now. I didn't call him that night. Instead, I went to bed with the kind of stillness that only comes after you've made a decision so complete that even your body relaxes around it. No doubts, no tears, just clarity. I knew what I needed to do. I wasn't going to scream or post a passive-aggressive rant online. I wasn't going to burn bridges. I was going to quietly dismantle them and let them fall behind me. The next morning, I made myself coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and composed an email that started with one simple sentence. "I'm ready now. Tell me how we start." I didn't need to say anything more. Ethan replied within an hour, and what he sent back wasn't a list of questions or legal jargon. It was a single line, one that made my pulse slow with something like relief, or maybe power. "Then let's begin." And just like that, I opened the first door I had ever chosen for myself, not because I was pushed or needed approval, but because for once I didn't care who was watching, or if anyone even noticed at all. I clicked send, and somewhere in Dubai, between the glittering skyline and the overpriced room service, my family was toasting to their idea of perfection, not knowing that their daughter, always the backup plan, always the afterthought, had just set something in motion they wouldn't be able to stop. Not this time. Not ever again. There's a strange kind of calm that settles over you when you finally stop asking for fairness from people who only understand currency and attention and favoritism. A kind of quiet that isn't peace exactly, but something even more dangerous: resolve. When I clicked send on that email to Ethan Vega, I wasn't sure what I expected to feel in the seconds that followed, but it wasn't guilt, and it definitely wasn't fear. It was a kind of exhale, like finally putting down a heavy box you'd been carrying so long you forgot how light your body could be without it. My whole life, I'd been told I was the level-headed one, the reliable one, the daughter who never made trouble and didn't ask for anything she hadn't earned twice over. And yet here I was, setting off a chain of events that would make trouble seem like a tea party compared to what was coming. Ethan didn't waste time with pleasantries. He replied with a question so sharp and surgical it felt like a challenge. "Do you want to walk away clean, or do you want them to feel it?" I stared at those 12 words longer than I probably needed to, my fingers hovering over the keys, my heart beating not out of panic, but something closer to adrenaline. I could have walked away. I could have packed my things, left a polite note, and started over in a new city with a new job and a new phone number. But the truth was, I didn't just want out. I wanted them to see the empty space I left and understand, for the first time in their lives, what it meant to live without the person who had been their invisible scaffolding all these years. I wanted them to feel the shape of my absence, so I wrote back. I want them to feel it, every step of it. From that moment on, Ethan and I communicated only through encrypted messages and occasional burner calls. He was good, brilliant actually, the kind of man who could trace an offshore transaction faster than most people could make a cup of coffee. And within 48 hours, he had already begun mapping the financial web my father had spun, with the casual entitlement of someone who thought laws were more of a suggestion when applied to men with expensive suits and golf club memberships. What he uncovered didn't shock me as much as it confirmed what I'd always suspected, but never had the tools or language to articulate. My father had used my name, my credit, my social security number, and my clean financial history as a silent partner in more than one family investment. And by family, but of course, I mean Chase. It turned out the reason I hadn't qualified for that mortgage on my own 2 years ago, despite having near-perfect credit and a 6-figure income, was because my name was already tied to 2 business loans and 1 property deed, all of which were under shell companies Chase had been operating. Companies that, by the way, didn't actually do anything except lose money. Ethan said it plainly, without drama or sugarcoating. "You've been used as collateral, and if this blows up, and it will, you'll be holding the bag." That was the moment something inside me snapped. Not loudly, not explosively, but like the soft click of a lock turning from the inside. I'd always believed my parents were blind to their favoritism, guilty of ignorance, not cruelty. But now I saw the truth. They weren't just complicit, they were architects. They had built this machine using my name as the fuel and Chase as the flashy hood ornament. While I sat in meetings earning promotions and negotiating contracts, they had been signing me up for a future I didn't agree to, one where my usefulness was my silence and my loyalty was weaponized against me. I sent Ethan every document I had, emails, copies of tax filings, the bank correspondence that didn't make sense at the time, but now glowed red with meaning. I even found a PDF from 2 years ago, where my father had digitally signed my name using a stylized signature he once asked me to scan for a family scrapbook project. That signature, now attached to a loan agreement worth $200,000, was the final nail in whatever faith I had left in their decency. Ethan asked if I wanted to press charges. I said no, not yet, because I didn't want prison bars. I wanted discomfort, the kind that creeps into a man's soul when his reputation starts to wobble and his phone calls stop getting returned. I wanted whispers in boardrooms and awkward silences at fundraising galas. I wanted them to face the kind of scrutiny they had never known, the kind I had been subjected to my whole life, at school, at work, at family dinners, when I was held to a higher standard just because I didn't come wrapped in excuses. The next phase of the plan was subtle, elegant. Ethan drafted a report, meticulously detailed, outlining the fraudulent activity, the identity misuse, and the shell corporations that could all be traced back to my father and brother. That report wasn't sent to the authorities, yet. It was printed on legal stationery, stamped, signed, and placed inside a tamper-proof envelope addressed to the general counsel of the financial firm where my father sat on the board. We didn't send it immediately. We waited. Because timing, Ethan said, was everything. But I wasn't content to sit idly. I needed to do something tangible, something real, something that reminded me this wasn't just a legal maneuver, it was personal. I went to our shared storage unit, the one my father insisted on keeping in my name for tax reasons, and cleaned it out. I threw away the boxes labeled Chase, college stuff, burned the binders full of receipts from their fake business trips, and took a hammer to the framed family photo that used to hang above the fireplace back when we pretended Sunday dinners were sacred. I packed only what I owned, truly owned, and loaded it into my car. Before I left, I wrote 3 letters, one for my father, one for my mother, and one for Chase. They weren't emotional, they weren't even angry. They were surgical in tone, a calm autopsy of the ways they had turned me into a placeholder in my own life. To my father, I wrote, "You taught me how to be useful, but never how to be loved." To my mother, I said, "Your silence was your signature on every betrayal." And to Chase, I left a line he might not understand until it was too late. Being chosen isn't the same as being worthy, and someday you'll feel that difference. I left the letters on the entry table, right where the houseplants used to sit before Mom overwatered them and blamed the maid. I didn't lock the door behind me. I wanted it wide open when they returned, so the air could be thick with absence and consequence. The last thing I did before getting in the car was check the tracking status on the envelope addressed to Dubai. It was marked as delivered, signed for, by Chase. I smiled, not because I was happy, but because I finally understood what it felt like to stop waiting for someone to save you and start being the one who sets the fire and walks away, without looking back. There is something darkly poetic about realizing that the person everyone else worships, the grinning, charismatic center of your family's orbit, isn't just flawed but rotten at the core. A man held aloft not by merit or virtue, but by a scaffolding of delusion, blind loyalty, and money that was never really his to begin with. I had always known, on some instinctual level, that Chase was a master of failing upward, that his charm operated like currency in our house, allowing him to cash in affection and forgiveness while the rest of us, or more precisely I, was expected to pay the debt with silence, support, and a kind of emotional labor that left me both exhausted and invisible. But what I hadn't fully grasped, until Ethan began peeling back the financial layers, was just how deep the rot went and how far my family was willing to go to cover it up, even if it meant putting me directly in harm's way. It started, as these things often do, with a trail of inconsistencies, subtle at first, like shadows you catch in the corner of your eye. There were wire transfers from family accounts labeled as consulting fees, deposited into companies that didn't appear to have employees, clients, or even functioning websites. There were business names registered to Chase that sounded impressive: Cyphernex Global, Lumnara Holdings, Black Sand Ventures, names that suggested innovation and expansion, but turned out to be nothing more than empty shells held together by flashy branding and my father's signature on dotted lines. Ethan, meticulous as ever, laid it out in a spreadsheet that read less like a legal report and more like a crime scene inventory. Chase hadn't just failed at his ventures. He had actively siphoned money into doomed investments, some of which had ties to questionable overseas entities, and all of which were propped up by personal guarantees forged under my name, or funneled through shared family trusts that, up until a week ago, I thought existed purely for estate planning. And still, the worst part wasn't the fraud itself or even the betrayal. It was the fact that none of this was hidden. Not really. My parents knew. They had to. The documents were in their filing cabinet. The tax records bore their names. The credit inquiries, the liens, the falsified signatures. There were too many overlapping connections for this to be chalked up to ignorance. They didn't just protect Chase. They enabled him, armed him with plausible deniability, and used me as the liability shield, assuming I'd be too loyal or too tired to ever make noise. And for a long time, they were right. I didn't make noise. I cleaned up messes. I lent him money I never expected to get back. I gave up holidays, weekends, and even part of a promotion once when my father asked me to help your brother sort out his tax mess. That was the exact phrase, sort out his tax mess, as if it were spilled coffee on a table and not a web of financial malpractice. But now, with every detail Ethan uncovered, the picture sharpened into something I could no longer justify or minimize. Chase wasn't just reckless, he was dangerous. Not in the way of fists or shouting matches, but in the quiet, entitled way of a man who knew the world would cushion his every fall, and that cushion had always been me. I remember the day it all crystallized, the day I stopped seeing him as a misguided brother and started seeing him as the enemy. Ethan had forwarded me a legal document Chase had filed with an investor group in Singapore. In it, he listed himself as the CEO of a boutique tech firm valued at $10 million. The valuation was pure fiction, but what made my stomach drop was the list of executive backers. There, in bold print, was my name, Melissa Carter, COO, followed by a fabricated LinkedIn profile, complete with a fake bio, picture, and resume. According to Chase's version of me, I had worked at Google, held a patent in AI development, and had been featured in Forbes 30 Under 30, which, aside from being hilarious given I was 42, was so absurd I might have laughed if I hadn't been so horrified. He hadn't just stolen my name. He had built an entire professional identity around me, one that didn't exist, but one that was being used to lure investors and secure capital. I stared at the screen, trying to process how long this had been going on, and how many hands had seen this imaginary version of myself without me even knowing. It wasn't just a lie. It was a performance, a show he'd been running behind my back, using my face, my credentials, my reputation as the bait in a trap I had never agreed to build. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring out the window as the city moved on like nothing had changed, and I felt the urge to scream, not from anger, but from sheer disbelief. I wasn't naive. I knew families had secrets, that brothers could be selfish, and that money had a way of making people blind. But this was something else entirely. This was orchestrated theft, wrapped in a family photo. This was betrayal dressed up in matching holiday sweaters and Instagram captions. I called Ethan. My voice was calm, but my hands were shaking. I want to go public, I told him. I want to burn it all down. He paused. You sure you want to take it that far? I didn't hesitate. He's using me as the face of a company that doesn't exist. That's fraud. I'm not walking away quietly while they keep cashing checks with my name on them. Ethan understood. He always did. Then we need leverage. Something that'll make them beg you to stay silent. The next morning, I called the anonymous whistleblower hotline, tied to one of Chase's investors. I gave them just enough information to make them curious, and then hung up before they could ask for more. I didn't want it to blow the whistle. I wanted to aim it at the exact moment they'd be the most vulnerable. Later that day, I received a text from Ethan. It was a screenshot of a forum where disgruntled investors were beginning to ask questions. One had posted a warning. Fake execs, smoke and mirrors, something stinks at Limnara. That was the opening, the crack in the armor. All I had to do now was wait. Because Chase wasn't going to fall from grace in a blaze of glory. He was going to unravel, thread by thread, while the people who had worshipped him watched in horror and confusion. And I was going to be the one holding the scissors. There's a moment in every woman's life, often subtle, often silent, when the roles she's been assigned without consent finally collapse under the weight of exhaustion, when the invisible scripts she's followed so diligently for years begin to disintegrate in her hands, and she realizes, with startling clarity, that the person she has been performing is not the person she is, nor the one she's willing to keep pretending to be. For me, that moment came not with a loud declaration or a climactic confrontation, but in the simple act of standing in the hallway of my childhood home, surrounded by the lingering scent of my mother's lavender cleaner and the ever-so-slight creak of the baseboards that had gone unfixed since I was 11, staring at the place where a family portrait used to hang, smiling faces frozen in a lie that had outlived its usefulness. It was strange being there alone, knowing they were still halfway around the world, indulging in imported delicacies and rooftop views while I roamed the house like a ghost revisiting her own grave, gathering pieces of myself that had been carelessly left behind, collecting memories I no longer wanted but couldn't quite discard, like emotional artifacts in a museum curated by guilt and obligation. Every room whispered something I had long tried to ignore, the cabinet in the den that still held my debate trophies, tucked behind my brother's framed articles and startup features, the hallway closet where my old winter coat, the one I bought with my first paycheck out of college, still hung untouched, its sleeves stiff with time, a quiet reminder that no one had even thought to donate it or throw it away. I moved through the house methodically, not in a rage, but with the calm precision of someone performing a long overdue exorcism, wiping away fingerprints that had once felt like home, and realizing, with something resembling relief, that I no longer wanted this place to be mine. I didn't take much. A few photo albums I had hidden behind the linen sheets, a stack of old letters from a friend I'd lost touch with, the gold necklace my grandmother had given me the summer before she died, the one my mother always insisted looked too modest to wear in public. I left behind the things they'd gifted me over the years, the jewelry that felt more like transactions, the dresses with tags still attached because they were never my size, never my style, never meant for me to wear, but merely for me to admire. I didn't want their offerings. I wanted freedom. And freedom doesn't weigh much when it's the only thing you're carrying. I went room to room, locking up what needed to be locked, sorting through drawers like a forensic analyst piecing together the blueprint of a life that had been engineered for someone else's comfort. I found receipts for donations made in Chase's name, but funded by the shared trust. I found half-written speeches my father had drafted for Chase's business award dinners. Speeches that, as it turns out, were plagiarized from press kits Ethan had already flagged as fraudulent. I found a birthday card from 2 years ago addressed to me, never signed, never mailed, tucked behind a stack of bills, and I stood there holding it for a long while, not crying, not fuming, just breathing it in. A life where my presence had always been more convenient than cherished. A life where my loyalty had been leveraged like collateral. But what mattered most wasn't what I found, it was what I left. I had spent years speaking gently, asking for the bare minimum, retreating at the first sign of conflict because keeping the peace had been drilled into me like a commandment. But this time, I didn't retreat. I wrote. I wrote 3 letters. Not long, not poetic, but deliberate, and worse for them, unflinchingly clear. To my father, I addressed the numbers. I listed every instance of fraud Ethan had traced, every forged document bearing my name, every dollar funneled through accounts that were opened under the guise of trust. I reminded him of the time I was denied a business loan and called him crying, and how he had assured me, sometimes banks just don't want to lend to women in your field, as though my gender, not his deceit, had been the barrier. I ended the letter with a line that I hoped would echo in his head long after I was gone. You were willing to sacrifice me for his future. But I never agreed to be your casualty. To my mother, I didn't bother with accounting. I focused on the silence. I reminded her of the birthdays she forgot, the dinners where I sat quietly while she gushed over Chase's latest idea, the afternoons when I came home in tears and she offered advice instead of comfort. I wrote, "You taught me that love was something I had to earn, that being the dependable daughter meant I was too strong to need affection. You convinced yourself I didn't mind. But I did. I just learned not to ask. And to Chase, I left only one page. On it, I printed a screenshot of the investor form Ethan had sent me, the one where anonymous users were beginning to piece together the inconsistencies in his story. Beneath it, I wrote, "You can't scam people forever, not when you leave your messes in the hands of someone who finally decided to clean them up. Good luck finding a new scapegoat. I've retired." I placed the letters on the dining table, each one resting on a dinner plate, like a final course served cold. The same table where we had sat dozens of times pretending to be a family, passing dishes with fake smiles, pretending nothing was broken while the foundation cracked beneath our feet. I didn't know how they would react when they returned. Shock, denial, rage, maybe even some performative remorse. But it no longer mattered to me. Their feelings were no longer my problem. Before I walked out, I checked the bank account one last time. The shared trust had been closed. My portion, calculated to the cent, had been wired to a separate account in my name. One Ethan helped me set up in a different state, under a newly registered LLC. I had filed paperwork for a consulting firm, small but clean, built from the ground up with no debt, no lies, and no co-signed disasters. And then, with a strange mix of finality and liberation, I placed my house key on the counter, next to the scented candle my mother always lit when guests were coming over. Citrus and pine, the smell of artificial hospitality. I didn't leave a forwarding address. I didn't leave breadcrumbs. I left a vacuum. Let them walk through that door expecting familiarity and find only echoes. Let them search for the daughter they once took for granted and find instead the aftermath of choices they made long before I ever fought back. Let them read those letters over wine or rage or stunned silence and come to whatever conclusions help them sleep at night. I was done explaining. And the sound of that key hitting the counter, that soft metallic click, was louder than any scream I had never allowed myself to make. When they finally walked through the door, sunburned from days beneath an artificial sky, their carry-on bags still scented faintly with imported perfume and hotel linens, their minds likely buzzing with stories they couldn't wait to tell, filtered through that ever-present lens of curated privilege, they found exactly what I had intended to leave them. A stillness so total it echoed off the walls like a question, unanswered and unanswerable, wrapped in the sterile quiet of absence that cannot be explained away with excuses or sentimental rewrites. The air must have felt strange to them, too clean, too sharp, as though someone had cracked open the windows and let in a truth they'd spent decades keeping out. My father, who always liked to leave lights on for show, would have noticed the dimness first. My mother, obsessed with tidiness, but oblivious to meaning, would have focused on the missing coat in the hallway closet or the way the pillows on the couch had been rearranged by a hand that no longer felt the need to ask permission. And on the counter, next to the dried-out basil plant that nobody had bothered to water, they would have seen it. The key, cold and heavy, not flung in anger, but placed with precision, a quiet punctuation mark at the end of a sentence they never believed I'd write. And just behind it, the envelope. Not labeled dramatically, not scrawled with read-me and theatrical ink, just addressed, in my handwriting, to each of them individually, like a business memo or an invoice for a debt long overdue. I imagine there must have been a pause before they reached for it, a hesitation born not of fear, but confusion, because for people who have never considered that someone might leave them without begging, the very idea of departure must feel foreign, even offensive. I do not know if they read the letters right away, or if they circled them like emotional landmines, trying to gauge how badly it would hurt before they let the truth inside. I do not know if my mother cried, or if my father cursed, or if Chase, arrogant and unshakable, dismissed the whole thing as a dramatic tantrum before realizing, in the hours or days that followed, just how much had slipped through his fingers. What I do know is that by the time they processed what had happened, by the time the lawyer's letter arrived in Dubai, and by the time Chase opened that envelope expecting a care package but finding instead a legal notification regarding an internal review triggered by a suspicious investor, I was already gone. Not hiding, not running, not broken, just gone. Gone in the way they had never considered possible, because they had always assumed I would orbit them forever, like some compliant moon tethered to their gravitational pull, content to reflect their light while suppressing my own. But the truth is, I hadn't been theirs for a long time. Maybe not ever. I had simply been too careful, too quiet, too loyal to admit that the version of myself they loved was a mask I wore to survive the constant shrinking of my worth beneath the weight of their expectations. And now, with the mask discarded, I didn't feel small. I felt limitless. I watched, from a safe distance, literally and metaphorically, as the walls began to tremble. The firm my father sat on the board of began requesting clarification on financial ties to one of Chase's shell companies, which, thanks to Ethan's strategic release of information, had become a point of concern for potential litigation. Chase's bank accounts, bloated with other people's trust, began to shrink as wire transfers were frozen and queries were launched. And though none of it would lead to an arrest, at least not immediately, the damage was already done where it mattered. It mattered most. In the spaces they once occupied without question, in the reputations they used to shield their sins, in the faces of people who had once been admirers and were now suddenly quiet. There was no dramatic downfall, no arrest at dawn, no teary confession, just discomfort, just erosion, just the slow, relentless peeling back of a veneer they had spent years polishing, revealing not villains exactly, but cowards, people who had chosen, again and again, the path of least resistance, even when it cost them the daughter they claimed to love. And me, I didn't become someone else. I didn't move to Europe or dye my hair or start writing poetry under a pseudonym. I simply started living the kind of life I had always denied myself out of guilt. I opened my consulting firm, small at first, but real, tangible, built on skills I had acquired honestly, without deception or shortcuts. I moved into a modest apartment with tall windows and no ghosts, where I cooked meals for myself without setting a place for people who never showed up. And I slept in a bed that no longer carried the weight of inherited expectation. For the first time in years, I did not check my phone for family group messages that never included me, or social media photos I was cropped out of, or Chase's latest announcement that everyone was expected to applaud while I was handed the camera. And slowly, without ceremony, I began to reclaim the space I had given up inside my own life. Not with revenge fantasies or spiteful declarations, but with the quiet power of someone who no longer needs an audience to feel seen. I planted herbs on my balcony, not because I needed them, but because they made me smile. I painted my office the color my mother always said was too loud for a woman over 30. I wore lipstick that didn't match my outfit. I stopped apologizing in emails. I laughed when I was alone. I stopped asking, did I overreact? And started asking, why did I wait so long? They haven't reached out, not really. There have been a few shallow attempts, a text from my mother around the holidays with no punctuation, an email from my father asking if I'd consider talking, which sounded less like an invitation and more like a summons. Chase, of course, stayed silent. Too embarrassed or too proud, perhaps both. And I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't need to. They made their choices, loud, clear, and without hesitation, and I finally made mine. Revenge wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with broken glass or slammed doors or televised ruin. It came with walking away without warning, with taking back my name, my time, my value. It came with leaving the key, the letters, and the silence behind me like a trail of breadcrumbs I never intended to follow. And the best part? They will never know when exactly they lost me. Only that one day they came home, and I wasn't there.